Death is scary enough, but humans have always found ways to make it even worse. Throughout history, execution methods have ranged from quick and brutal to slow and horrifying. Some of these methods were designed not just to kill, but to make the victims suffer as much as possible before they died. Today, we are diving into the most painful execution methods ever used. Buckle up because this is going to be a disturbing ride. 1. The breaking wheel. When your bones become dust. The pain of a hairline fracture is unbearable. Now imagine being tied to a giant wooden wheel while someone crushes every single bone in your body. That's the breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel, and it was as cruel as it sounds. The executioner would start by breaking the victim's legs and arms, making sure they stayed alive to experience maximum pain. Sometimes, they'd weave the broken limbs through the wheel's bars and leave the person to die slowly. If the authorities were feeling merciful, huge sarcasm here, they'd give the victim a final blow to the chest to speed things up. But most of the time, they just let nature take its painful class. Imagine lying there with your bones turned into a jigsaw puzzle, waiting for death to come. Brutal. 2. The Blood Eagle, Vikings' nightmare fuel. If you thought Vikings were all about raiding and drinking nectar, wait till you hear about the Blood Eagle. This was not just an execution. It was a statement. The victim's back was cut open, ribs broken outwards, and lungs pulled out to resemble wings. The worst part, the victim was kept alive throughout most of the process. This was usually reserved for enemies of Viking rulers, and it was meant to send a clear message. Mess with us, and we'll turn your back into a bizarre art piece. If this isn't nightmare fuel, I don't know what is. 3. Flaying. A slow peel to the afterlife. Flaying was exactly what it sounds like, having your skin removed while you were still alive. Some unlucky souls experienced this in medieval Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. The executioner would start peeling the skin from the feet or arms and work their way up. This wasn't a quick process either. It could take hours before the victim finally died from shock, infection, or simply losing too much blood. If the executioner was particularly skilled, sarcasm, they could keep the person alive for a long time. Imagine the pain of a paper cut and multiply it by 1,000,000. That's flaying for you. 4. Lingqi, death by 1,000 cuts. The ultimate suffering, the Chinese method of lingqi, or death by 1,000 cuts, was a slow-motion death. It was used as a punishment for serious crimes like treason. The executioner would take a sharp blade and start slicing off small pieces of flesh, bit by bit, while the victim was still conscious. It wasn't a quick process. It was pure suffering, stretched over minutes or even hours. Eventually, they'd go for a major organ, or the throat. But by that time, the victim had already been through hell. Some historical records say they were even given heroin to delay the suffering. This was truly one of the most horrifying ways to go. 5. Sawing. A death you can feel inch by inch. Now picture this. You're hanging upside down, completely helpless, while two guys slowly see you in half. This method of execution, popular in ancient Rome, China, and even parts of medieval Europe, was nothing short of horrific. The reason for hanging the victim upside down was simple. The blood would rush to their brain, keeping them conscious for as long as possible. The saw would start from the groin and work its way down, or up, depending on how you look at it. Either way, the victim was aware of every painful second. This wasn't just about execution. It was about making sure the person suffered beyond belief. 6. Scaphism. The worst way to rot alive. If there's a competition for the most horrifying execution method, scaphism might just win. The Persians used this as one of their cruelest punishments. Here's how it worked. The victim was stripped naked and placed inside a hollowed-out log or boat, with their hands, feet, and head sticking out. Then, they were force-fed milk and honey until they had severe diarrhea. Yes, it gets worse. They'd then be left floating on a swamp or muddy water, where insects and bacteria would slowly eat them alive. The victim would die after days or even weeks rotting, being ripped apart by maggots and suffering from infections. This was psychological and physical torture on another level. 7. Brazen bull, roasting alive in a metal cow. The ancient Greeks had their twisted execution device, the brazen bull. This was a hollow, life-sized metal bull, and the victim was locked inside. Then, a fire was lit underneath, turning it into an oven. As the person burned alive, their screams would be increased through tubes, making it sound like the bull was roaring. Yep, they even turned suffering into an audio experience. It's said that the inventor of this device, Perillos of Athens, was ironically the first person to be cooked inside it when the tyrant he made it for decided to test it on him. Talk about karma. 8. Impalement, a slow and miserable end. Vlad the Impaler, the inspiration for Dracula, was a big fan of this one. The victim was forced to sit on a sharpened wooden stake, which was then gradually pushed through their body, sometimes through the abdomen, sometimes straight through the backside, if done correctly. In the most horrible sense of the word, the stake would avoid major organs, prolonging the suffering for hours or even days. This wasn't just an execution, it was a warning to others. Vlad once stabbed thousands of enemy soldiers, leaving their bodies on display as a twisted message to anyone thinking of invading his land. Safe to say, it worked. 9. Slow roast anyone, boiling, and burning alive. Many of the unhurried and cruelest executions in history have involved criticism, being steadily cooked in some way, though not normally with consumption in mind. In 1532, Chef Richard Roos was boiled to death in Smithfield, London, for the crime of poisoning. He was chained to a frame and repeatedly dipped into a boiling pot, dying after 2 hours. This continual burning was done to maximize the suffering. Skin would pop and blister horribly from the burns, causing severe pain. It was mostly bones that remained. 10. Clubbing. No, not the sort of clubbing that involves drinking and dancing in the early hours of the morning, but rather clubbing as a form of execution. This deadly Roman punishment, known as fustuarium, was a penalty for fearfulness. Troops who had deserted their posts or run away in battle would be beaten to death with rough and tough instruments by members of their unit. This harsh form of military discipline could be used for a range of other offenses by soldiers too, including lying and stealing. 11. Dropping onto rocks. A popular form of execution in the classical world was dumping offenders from a height, typically from a cliff, where the community would see them paint the hard ground below red. This legal throwing from heights was used in ancient Greece, but the ancient Romans' use of it from the famous Tarpeian Rock is more well known today. Convicts guilty of crimes like murder and sedition would be launched from the rock, which sent them down the side of the Capitoline Hill in Rome to death, 25 meters below. The Tarpeian Rock was used for public executions in Rome from the time of the Roman kings, from over 2,500 years ago to the 1st century AD. Surprisingly, considering the many different brutal methods of execution used by the ancient Romans over the centuries, the Romans considered this as one of the worst ways to go because they attached so much shame to it. So yeah, if you ever thought modern execution methods were inhumane, just take a look back at history. These brutal methods weren't just about ending a life. They were about making sure the process was as painful and horrifying as possible. Thankfully, most of these have been abandoned, though some countries still hold public executions. But these historical punishments remind us how cruel humans can be when they set their minds to it. Which one of these do you think was the worst? Let me know in the comments. And if you made it through this video without feeling sick, congrats, you've got a strong stomach. See you in the next one.